When we think about silent comedy, especially the slapstick comedy, because of course there was the boardroom comedy, the comedy of manners as well going on at the time, though it's what we call slapstick that tends to stick with us. There's lots of things that turn people off, silent cinema in general, but silent comedy included in that. And one is the idea that these films are primitive. And yes, certainly at the start of the 1910s, they were, of course, very primitive. Films are still a very young medium. But roundabout by 1920, what we're looking at is some very, very sophisticated filmmakers. This is low comedy, is true to an extent. It is an awful lot of people falling over and hitting each other and violence. But there is an elegance to that. And I'd say that Chaplin brings a balleticism to comedy, and the other two certainly bring very sophisticated techniques of building up a gag through the medium of cinema that transcends their theatrical backgrounds. So definitely not unsophisticated. It really isn't people falling over on banana skins. One of the things that really is a problem is bad prints of old films. One of the blessings of YouTube is that there's lots of very good quality versions of a lot of the films. You can see, I think, everything I'm going to talk about tonight on YouTube, and the quality of print is usually good. But you can also get some very bad prints where you miss the joke because the quality of the image is so poor. Poor old Buster Keaton in particular suffered from decades of really low quality prints of his films. And awful music. Jaunty seaside organ is one way of killing silent comedy. Also, we should be watching this as a group. When I watch these films on my own, I'll find them funny. If I watch them with my children, we'll all be guffawing at them, especially my daughter, who loves Charlie Chaplin. And if we think about Chaplin in particular, who I'm going to start with, these films are very anarchic, they're very transgressive. Lots and lots of class issues are right at the heart of the silent comedy that we're looking at, usually puncturing the bubbles and niceties. We shouldn't look at these films as nostalgic. Those of you around the same age as me may well remember the Harold Lloyd TV series from the 1970s, which had the jaunty theme song, which claimed, "He'll take you back to years gone by." But at the time these films were being made, they were incredibly modern. They were all about man in the modern world of the 1920s, where things were changing very, very rapidly. Skyscrapers were going up, new technology was coming out, Fordism was producing all these cars and factories, and all of these guys address this. So I want to start by looking at a typical Keystone film. And this is the background for Chaplin in particular, and Lloyd very briefly. And the character we're going to see is Sid Chaplin, Charlie's brother. I don't want to knock him as a performer, but I've chosen this as it's reasonably typical of a scene from a Keystone film. Why is any of this happening? It's people just kind of hitting each other, which has some sort of amusement value to it, but there's no purpose there. Why is the man on the crutches suddenly pulling out a gun and shooting and all this feinting and hitting each other? This is the entrance to the style of movies that Chaplin found himself. And in the 1920s, the philosopher Henri Bergson said that laughter erupts when someone behaves in a mechanical way. And this is the sort of thing that we're seeing here. And Keystone films were really, really popular. But this is unsophisticated. It is low comedy. Cinematically, it's not particularly interesting. And for us now, we don't quite know where to look. I do want to spend a few seconds redeeming Sid Chaplin. He obviously came from the same background as Charlie, and he's got a lot of the same skills. And we'll see it in this brief little clip here. We can see that Charlie Chaplin doesn't come out of nowhere. He's clearly been brought up in the same environment, has that same training, that physicality, and some of the mannerisms that Sid is displaying there clearly come from the more famous Chaplin brothers' background in music hall. And I'm also going to be fair to a submarine pirate. There are some quite funny scenes on a submarine later on in the film. There is the more famous of the two brothers, and there he is on stage. Sid's in there somewhere. I'm not sure which one Sid is, but Chaplin's life was essentially on stage. And the bit that wasn't on stage was living in abject poverty. He really did have a Victorian, Dickensian poorhouse background. It's unimaginably deprived as a background that the Chaplin brothers were coming from. And this, of course, feeds into a lot of the mannerisms of the tramp. Charlie recounts in his autobiography having seen this guy who used to help the hansom cab drivers by holding their horses, and he had that funny walk that Charlie as a child imitated. So essentially, the character of the tramp is most mockingly afflicted. But let's have a look at Charlie Chaplin's first film appearance in what is to develop as the tramp. And this is Kid Auto Races at Venice. And this was something that Keystone used to like to do. Take a film crew out to an event that was going on anyway and filming it and improvising it. And this is what Charlie does. The trousers are going to get baggier. The walk is probably going to get more pronounced. And this is an interesting debut. It's the knockabout style. But notice there that Charlie is the only one performing. And unlike the other clip we saw, everyone else is actually either acting naturalistically, chucking this guy out of the frame, or they're just watching what's going on, thinking, who's this guy? Imagine, who's this guy? Charlie Chaplin? There was a period when that was the case. So the performance style is remarkably different from what we saw. So even though there's a lot of people in the frame, the focus is on one character. And this is something that develops more and more with Chaplin as he goes on. The pathos that we associate with Chaplin isn't there at all until about a year later. So the early Chaplin is full on the vulgarity, sticking pitchforks up other people's backsides, opportunistic. He will steal, he will lie, he will do all these things. He's actually quite an aggressive character, and the Chaplin that we think of doesn't develop for about another year or so, and that's quite a lot of films later. It's with films like The Pawn Shop that we start to see one of Chaplin's key skills really appear, and this is one of the things that he becomes justly celebrated for in his performance, and it's the transformation of the object. So let's have a look at this really famous sequence. The other guy in the frame is one of Chaplin's co-stars, Albert Austin, who's got the thankless task of just standing there, responding very minimally to what Chaplin's doing. I think he performs the part really well. That's better than the submarine pirate clip, isn't it? It's not quite one shot, but it feels like one shot. But just two actors in the frame, one's doing all the heavy lifting, and it's all that physicality. We'll just keep the long shot on the action, and this is right at the heart of Chaplin's art. So he develops this. So he's got the style, he's got the balleticism, and there's this gradual shift away from the vulgarity and a distinct change of pace. And this is what Chaplin brings. And of course, it also brought in millions. It's quite ironic that the journey that Charles Chaplin, the performer, makes from abject poverty into being a multi-millionaire, world's most famous man, is complete inverse to the character he plays, who he said he imagined as a once grand Englishman who's down on his luck. Other accounts say he's supposed to be an American vagabond, and I think Chaplin changed the story quite a lot. But I always like the idea of the once grand Englishman down on his luck. That's the one I favour. Anyway, I just want to show you a brief bit from this other 1915 film called The Tramp. And this is right at the end of the story. And Charlie thinks that the woman, Edna Purviance, who was his co-star in many films and lover, loves him. But it turns out right at the end that actually she loves another man. And this is the moment where the tramp has just found out. So we're right at the very, very end of the film. And this is the big gamble that Charlie took. He was worried about this. And this is where we see the development of the tramp as we know him. It's that little moment at the end where he walks off dejected. It hasn't gone his way. He's going to move on. He's not going to find love. And then the walk, and then he just picks himself up and carries on. This really endeared him to his fans, though Chaplin nearly cut it, thinking it was too far from the comedy that he was supposed to be doing. By the next year, and The Vagabond, he's developing this same idea even further. A lot of people accuse Chaplin of milking the pathos. I think he earns it. And we see similar circumstances at the end where he's rescued. It's Edna Purviance again, and her rich family have come to take her away. It's the last minute of the film. And luckily, he turns it around so that we get that moment of redemption. Several of his really famous films end in a fairly similar way. He's all dejected, and we really, really want him to be scooped up and looked after. And this happens at the end of The Kid, slightly differently at the end of City Lights, and the last film he makes as the Tramp, Modern Times, well into the sound era. He goes off with the girl hand in hand, so he walks off, does the little jiggle. So we can see distinctly that development of the character. So as well as the little man, as Chaplin himself called the character, or Charlot as the French called him, Chaplin's other screen character was the drunk, and in his days in the Fred Karno troupe, it was the drunk who was the big draw. I'm going to show you this largely because my daughter loves this film, and she would be very cross with me if I didn't show you this. So this is 1 a.m. from 1916, and it's essentially 25 minutes of a very drunk Charlie trying to get up the stairs. We're not going to see the whole 25 minutes, but do go and check it out. It absolutely is a hoot. Let's just look at a couple of minutes of it. We've definitely got, despite the fact that the character is clearly ridiculous, some empathy. I think we can see he's not quite milking it as the tramp is accused of doing, but we want him to succeed as he's getting up those stairs. I've mentioned City Lights. I want to look at this boxing scene. It's largely one shot, not entirely one shot, but it really is just a very, very simple camera movement. This is something that we should directly compare to films by Lloyd and Keaton. A boxing ring was a staple of this sort of comedy. This is very typical of Chaplin in that it's largely what we'd call the proscenium staging. It's largely front on, as if we are sitting in an audience at a theatre. The camera will move to keep the actors in frame. We tend to see Chaplin in his location as centre with the set around him. And some might say that that's as a primitive method of filmmaking, but it fits Chaplin's style, which is very much performance first. A few things that come out of that. One is the length of the shots. One is the fact that I'm cheating slightly, and we're definitely into the sound era here. And obviously, the ringing of the bell is a sound gag, and Chaplin insisted that the little man stay silent. So he does carry on making what are ostensibly silent films into the sound era, but they do have music composed by Chaplin. They have sound gags, and the very famous scene where the blind flower seller mistakes him for a millionaire relies on the sound of an expensive motor car. So there are sound gags in there, and it's interesting to think about how this is the direction cinema could have gone in the early sound days, rather than synchronizing dialogue. It could have carried on with the majesty of late silent era cinema, just synchronizing sound effects. But no, it went off in the dialogue direction. By this point, Chaplin was running his own studio, directing himself, writing his own material, and he was rich enough that he would make films for himself as perfectly as he wanted to. So he wasn't worrying at all about commercial considerations. And by the time of City Lights, takes would go on for 40 or 50 takes. And we could imagine the coordination between the three actors, the referee and the two boxes in that scene. Imagine how many takes it could have taken to get a sequence like that right. One of the downsides of Chaplin's success and his perfectionism is that it really slowed down his work rate. So whereas Lloyd makes 11 feature films and several shorts through the 20s, Keaton makes 10 feature films and several shorts. Chaplin makes a handful of shorts, I forget how many, 4 or 5, I think, and only 3 feature films. So there's a big difference in his output. He was a big hit in Soviet Russia, who saw him as very much as fighting against the bourgeoisie. And so was Keaton as well. Also in City Lights, we're not going to have time to look at it, but this is a film where the little man meets the drunk. Obviously, we have the drunk is played by a different actor, but then, of course, he soon gets our little man drunk, and we see the drunk little man, and the two halves of the Chaplin screen persona start to merge. Overall, with Chaplin, the performance is key, that balleticism and grace, the vulgarity of the early days of slapstick. Chaplin completely changes, and we start to see other performers starting to take on a much more defined, less grotesque screen persona. The pace, he takes away that frenetic knockabout pace, puts it into something that is more manageable and funnier, and we have the time to build things up. The pathos, often used as a stick to beat Chaplin with. The transformation and anthropomorphism in his movement. A famous scene where he picks up a load of chairs and turns himself into a human hedgehog is great in Behind the Screen, for instance. That proscenium staging, focusing on the performer. And of course, the development of the star persona. There were movie stars from Florence Lawrence right at the start of the 20th century onwards, but Chaplin was huge. And once we start to get the press interest in the man behind the moustache and all the merchandise, we really start to see what we would distinctly recognize as stardom 100 years later.